pro wrestling fans are remembering one of the sport's legendary figures. Canadian-American Sweet Daddy Siki died earlier this week. Siki made a name for himself in the 60s to the 90s. He was known for his style and his bright blonde hair. He was an icon for generations to come, leaving his mark on the stars of today, including Canadian legend Adam Copeland, also known as Edge.
I mean, talk about a one of a kind. You're talking about a man who helped integrate this industry, who had the first African-American to have a championship match. Like, that's how far back Siki goes, through the 50s, through the 60s, through the 70s, through the 80s. So no one really knows the fact that Siki was one of the Jackie Robinsons of our industry.
Siki also spent time as a country musician and hosted karaoke events in Toronto right up until the pandemic. He was originally from Texas and moved to Canada in the 1960s. He died on December 31st at the age of 91. Well, Greg Oliver is a wrestling historian, and he joins me now to talk about Sweet Daddy Siki's journey and his love of boxing and wrestling. Thanks for giving us some time today.
Thank you. Anything for Sweet Daddy.
Well, tell us, if you would. Well, let's begin with how his story began.
Well, he was a sharecropper, son of a sharecropper, grew up poor. His mom died, and he ended up in Los Angeles, which turned out to be a good stroke of luck. The family there got him involved a little bit more with sports. He got involved with boxing. He saw the wrestlers. And after he served his country in the war in Korea, he was actually on a boat when they signed the peace treaty. Then when he came back to LA, he started training in earnest to be a boxer and then a wrestler. And it's an itinerary life from there. Like, you just keep traveling and getting better at your craft. And once he settled in on the gimmick known as Sweet Daddy Siki, with the blonde hair especially, he became a very memorable character wherever he worked, which was right around the world.
He was just compared to Jackie Robinson. I wanted to ask you a bit about how he broke down racial barriers that existed in sports at his beginning.
It's very true that he was a pioneer. However, the thing about pro wrestling is it's not as well documented in any way, shape, or form compared to baseball. So you can't necessarily say that he was the first, because chances are somebody's going to discover somewhere along the way that it didn't happen. It's just like Siki loved telling a story about facing Nature Boy Buddy Rogers for the world title in Greensboro, North Carolina, with the KKK in attendance. The fact is, though, that as historians, we've looked that up and have never been able to find that match. It's a great story, and he was amazing at telling it, and there's no doubt there's elements of truth to it all. But pro wrestling isn't like, hockey, when you can find out who scored which goal in which game. But for sure, wherever he wrestled, he got a chance to wrestle against white guys, wherever that was. And certainly he found a real home when he came up to Canada.
You played an active role with Siki and his family for a CBC documentary about his life. I gather you learned about his death from his son. What was he like outside of the ring? Reg,
as we called him, was both a little secretive, right? He was 7 years older than he ever told everyone he was. He didn't talk a lot about that kind of thing. But he was really quiet. He wasn't a braggart at all, right? He was all showman when he's out there performing. But he wasn't a braggart. He liked to listen to people. He would, people would see him sitting out on his porch. He lived near the exhibition grounds in Toronto, and people would wave at him, and he would talk with them. And of course, no matter where he goes, he's still Sweet Daddy Siki with that hair. People would stop and talk to him. So he definitely enjoyed being around people. I'll give him that. It took a little while to really get him to open up with the documentary, but we got there eventually. He didn't trust people very easily, I guess is a good way to put it. And the documentary is really good, and I'm glad we got it done, and Sweet Daddy Siki's memorialized in that way.
Is it true he used to drive around Toronto in a purple hearse? Or is that legend?
That was one of his gimmicks, yeah. That's a good way to get known, right, is having a purple hearse. But a lot of pro wrestlers had great big cars. Just Sweet Daddy's the only one I knew that had a purple hearse. And I know at one point, filmmaker Bruce McDonald chased him down to have him in one of his music videos, I think. That purple hearse was a very memorable thing.
Siki also left his mark on the wrestling world by training and coaching many pro wrestlers. People will know their names, for example, WWE Hall of Famer Adam Copeland and former NWA and WWE World Heavyweight Champion Christian Cage. How do you think he helped them or mentored them to build up their careers?
Well, there was Siki and there was Ron Hutchison that helped train those guys in particular. Wrestling's a real team sport in a sense that you're always learning from whoever it is. And Siki wasn't necessarily the one in there rolling around in the ring showing them the holds, but he's the one giving them lessons, right? And this is how to conduct yourself in the ring. This is how to conduct yourself when you're backstage. This is how to, and he just had stories about everywhere, and he helped them get those connections to be able to go have some of their first matches when they were out in the Maritimes for Emile Dupre. So he had all those connections as well, and definitely in those cases, both Edge and Christian really look up to Sweet Daddy and think very highly of him.
Final thought in terms of impact on the wrestlers of today. Are there any moves that live on? I gather some of his famous moves were called the airplane spin or the neck breaker.
They're actually a little bit quaint when you look at some of the matches or some of the moves that they all do today. Sweet Daddy Siki had one of the best drop kicks in the business. That still goes on today. The one I like to always point out, though, is that he was a mentor to Rocky Johnson, and then Rocky Johnson's son becomes The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, one of the biggest stars in history, not just in wrestling. But The Rock used cutouts on his boots at the back, and that was straight from Sweet Daddy Siki. So, we've all seen a lot of Sweet Daddy Siki where you saw him wrestle in the ring or not because The Rock brought him along with him.
Great to get your memories and your insights about Siki as he's being remembered. Greg, thank you for this.
Thanks. I'd strut off camera if I was any good at it.
Oh, you know what? You're great. That was so interesting. Greg Oliver joining us.
Thank you.